Thanks, Raphael, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon where you happen to be. We're very excited about today's presentations. The topics of today's sessions are fiscal theory of trend inflation and detecting changes in inflation trends using high-frequency data. Again, my special thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schoenle from Brandeis University and SEBRA, and Dominic Smith from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. So just as a reminder about the format for today's presentation, the webinar is 45 minutes in total, with two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each and 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, post their questions during the presentations already and do not have to wait until the end. So that will actually make it easier for us to get in as many questions as possible. I will then select questions to be answered in the QA portion of the webinar after the presentation. As a reminder, the webinar is also live streamed via the SEBRA YouTube channel, recorded and made available on the SEBRA website and the SEBRA YouTube channel after the event. And so as a disclaimer for today's presentations, participation in the SEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a SEBRA or a SEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of SEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. So with all of that behind us, we're very excited again for today's speakers. I'd like to both introduce them. The session today will feature Francesco Bianca, professor of economics at Johns Hopkins University, who will be talking about a fiscal theory of trend inflation, and Alberto Carvalho, associate professor of the Harvard Business School, and Alberto will be talking about detecting changes in inflation trends using high-frequency data. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to Francesco. Thank you.
First of all, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks for the introduction. So this is joint work with Renato Faccini and Leonardo Melosi, who both work at central banks, so the usual disclaimer applies. So what we do in this paper is to build a general equilibrium model with the partially unfunded government debt. So the model features the standard frictions and shocks that have been proven useful to match business cycle dynamics in the empirical macro literature. But we augment this fairly standard model with what we call unfunded fiscal shocks. So these are shocks to transfers that are not fully backed by future fiscal adjustments. So the central bank accommodates the inflation that is needed to stabilize these unfunded fiscal shocks. And this generates, as we'll see in a moment, persistent movements in inflation that gives us what we call a fiscal theory of trend inflation. So we use this model both to understand the historical events of the US, but also to try to understand what is going on with inflation in the post-pandemic period. So what we're going to show is that the persistent spending increase that was due to the Great Society initiatives under President Johnson and the loose monetary policy that came with it gave us the great inflation. Inflation stopped during the Volcker years, but as a result of both changes in monetary policy that are easy to detect, but also changes in the perception of how debt will be stabilized. So the Reagan administration played a role in this sense. And after that, what we're going to argue is that it's not that fiscal inflation has disappeared, is that has been counteracting deflationary pressure coming from other sources. So it's almost like it was hidden, and it exploded in all its strength during the post-pandemic period as a result of large fiscal shocks. So in particular, when it comes to the pandemic period, we are going to do an exercise that is in two steps. So we are going to do one exercise that you could call in-sample, and then we're going to do an auto-sample exercise that I think it's a very good way to validate the model. So in particular, what we are going to show is that only a small fraction of the March 2020 fiscal stimulus was considered unfunded, but there was a change in perception about the share of funded versus unfunded amount of spending that came both with the review of the monetary policy framework that the Fed conducted, in which the Fed said that it was a bit more open to inflation, but especially with the large ARPA fiscal stimulus of 2021. And so what I'm going to show you is that the model out of sample can give a very accurate prediction of the increase in inflation that we saw. Now, just to put immediately things into context, we also want to highlight that it's true that we got a lot of inflation, but we also got a very quick rebound in the post-pandemic period that the model attributes in part to these unfunded fiscal shocks. So what are the main lessons of the paper? So the some fiscal inflation can be a way to prevent deflation, and in a sense, it can be beneficial. That's what happened during the zero lower bound period. Historically, unfunded fiscal shocks have been explaining low frequency movements in inflation. But once fiscal imbalances are so high, like they are today, even small changes in perceptions about the share of funded and funded debt can cause persistent movements in inflation. And I think this is a little bit of a lesson that is important to keep in mind when it comes to the challenges for the Federal Reserve in bringing inflation down. And you could argue that it's true for many other countries around the world. So the paper has a toy model in which we explain in detail how you build these funded versus unfunded shocks. So here I'm going to dive immediately in our quantitative model in a way that maybe we can have a discussion about the empirical results of the paper. And so what we do, we take this idea of separating the amount of spending that is in fact backed by future taxes versus the amount of spending that is not backed by future taxes, and incorporate it into a state-of-the-art tank model. So sometimes we get this question, why a tank model? Why do you need a two agents model as opposed to the standard New Keynesian model? Well, because as we're going to see, these unfunded fiscal shocks generate large movements in inflation. We want to make sure that in principle, even funded fiscal shocks generate movements in inflation or real activity. And so having some hand-to-mouth agents helps from that point of view. The rest of the model is probably similar to what researchers that work with New Keynesian models are used to. So there is price rigidities, wage rigidities, we have long-term government bonds, and then we have a typical set of business cycle shocks. Again, because our goal is to make sure that the results that we find are not driven by the fact that there is no other way to explain inflation as opposed to unfunded fiscal shocks. Okay, so we want to make sure that the model has other ways to explain movements in inflation. So we have the typical markup shocks, investment shocks, and so on. So the key innovation of the paper is then to separate these funded transfers from unfunded transfers. So in a technical sense, with respect to funded transfers, we have in place the standard monetary-led policy mix. So what is a monetary-led policy mix? Well, it's the situation that economists are used to think about. There is a central bank that satisfies the Taylor principle, and there is a fiscal authority that stands ready to increase taxes to stabilize debt. However, in response to unfunded transfers, we have the opposite policy combination. So now the central bank is willing to accept movements in inflation exactly because the fiscal authority is not committed to move primary surpluses to stabilize debt. Okay, so the nice thing about this model is that this, instead of being a model with regime changes, that's something I've worked in the past, these are two regimes, two policy mixes that coexist at the same time. The way policymakers behave differs based on the shock. So the key lesson here is that the monetary authority tolerates the increase in inflation that is necessary to cover the amount of spending that is not covered by future taxation. Okay, so when it comes to the equations, what we are going to have then, we are going to have two types of transfers. So here we call it zeta M and zeta F that differ in the way they enter the policy rules of policymakers. So, and in particular, we're going to have to keep track of the amount of debt that is in fact covered by future taxes versus the amount of debt that is not covered by future taxes. So what we are going to measure what we call fiscal trend inflation, that is the increase in inflation that is needed to stabilize the amount of debt that is actually not covered by future taxation. So technically, you can think about having a shared economy that keeps track of the amount of debt, let's call it BM for monetary-led policy mix, that is in fact covered by future taxes. Then there is a remaining portion of debt that is not covered by future taxes, and this is the amount of debt that needs to be covered with movements in inflation. So in the paper, we explain at length how to build these kind of models. Essentially, you need to have a shared economy that keeps track of what happens with respect to the amount of funded and unfunded debt. And in simple words, it's like an accounting exercise. For a given amount of debt, the model needs to decide how many fiscal resources are out there going forward to cover fiscal adjustments, the debt stabilization. Okay. So let me just skip, in the interest of time, to the empirical estimation. So we bring the model to the data using Bayesian methods. Of course, life is always more complicated than what you would hope for. And so we also need to deal with the zero lower bound. We do this by using some methods that have been developed by co-authors with some other economists at the Chicago Fed. And then the other key innovation, of course, we have all the fiscal variables, because for us, it's important to actually keep track of the amount of spending and the amount of debt. So now the key question is how we identify a funded fiscal shock versus an unfunded fiscal shock, okay? And how we differentiate these from possible other sources of inflation movements, okay? So I'm sorry, this slide for some reason got cut. So you can see that there was a third line that it doesn't appear, but I think the graph is pretty self-explanatory. So let me explain how the model works. So let's start with the funded transfer shocks. Let's focus on the black line. As you can see, a funded transfer shock, so an increase in spending that is backed by future taxes, has only a modest amount of inflation. It has a modest impact on the real interest rate that is positive because the Taylor principle applies. So in response to the increased inflation, the central bank increased the nominal interest rate. And the key feature is very intuitive. We spend more, we accumulate more debt. That seems like totally reasonable, no? What is then instead an unfunded transfer shock? Well, notice that now the increase in inflation is substantially larger. And the reason why we get this large increase in inflation is because agents do not expect that the extra amount of spending is going to be covered with future taxes. And you can see that the central bank accommodates this increase in inflation, so with a decline in the real interest rate. Now, the other distinctive feature is that in the moment you have low real interest rates, a booming economy, because this is a New Keynesian model, so we get an increase in real activity, the debt to GDP ratio, instead of going up, it goes down. So you have an increase in spending that actually lowers the debt to GDP ratio. And this comes from the fact that the increase in spending is spread over a long period of time, while the movement in real interest rates and real activity is front-loaded. Finally, in principle, you could say there are other shocks that could explain inflation. Well, let's consider, for example, a markup shock, that is this red line over here. You can see that even a markup shock can generate a robust increase in inflation, but it's very short-lasting, because the response of the central bank is very different. So now you see a large increase in the real interest rate. And again, the movement in that debt to GDP ratio is in the opposite direction with respect to unfunded fiscal shocks. Okay, so these are qualitatively the restrictions that allow us to identify the shocks in the model. The exact numbers that are reported here depends on our estimation, but as we discussed in the paper, from a qualitative point of view, this kind of responses hold for most New Keynesian models. Okay, so now what we are going to do is to try to understand what these unfunded fiscal shocks did historically and during the recent events. So in this graph over here on the left, you have the behavior of federal transfers in the data. You can see that they show an initial acceleration toward the beginning of the sample. Then they kind of go flat, starting from the mid-70s to the 1990s, and then they accelerate again toward the second half of the sample, and of course they jump during the pandemic. So when we decompose this picture in terms of funded and unfunded, some interesting results come out. So the first one you can see is that there is a rapid acceleration in unfunded transfers, these dark vertical bars, starting from the mid-60s. So this is when the Great Society initiatives were introduced. Then what happens, transfers kind of go flat. You can see here the red line. But if you focus on unfunded transfers, you can see that they keep increasing until the early 80s, and then they start declining since then. In the second part of the sample, we have this large acceleration of transfers, but they are mostly funded. So that's what keeps inflation relatively on check. And then when we zoom in on the recent events, there are two aspects that are very important. The first one is the large fiscal stimulus of the second quarter of 2020. But the other one that is very important, that it's a little bit hard to see in this graph, is that in the third quarter of 2020, so in a sense, after the first fiscal stimulus is announced, the Fed conducts a review in which it says that it's a bit more open to accepting inflation. And this determines an increase from the point of view of the model in the amount of debt that is in fact going to be washed out by inflation. And finally, we have the large ARPA fiscal stimulus that I will discuss in a moment. So from an historical point of view, you can see that the share of inflation that is explained by these unfunded fiscal shocks has actually been relatively high, even toward the end of the sample. And this is what prevents deflation. So this large fiscal inflation is actually what prevented deflation at the zero lower bound. So finally, let me discuss the results for the pandemic period that I think that are the most interesting for this audience. So let me consider an out-of-sample exercise, okay? So the blue line here is a projection of the model without the fiscal shocks. And then the red line is with the ARPA fiscal stimulus, okay? So the blue line, as you can see, is already doing a fairly good job in predicting that there is going to be inflation above target, so above the 2% target. And but when you actually add the ARPA fiscal stimulus, the red line, you get a projection that is very similar to what we observe, okay? So this is based on the GDP deflator. So the model predicts actually a robust increase in inflation above the target. And remember, this is an out-of-sample projection, so it's a non-in-sample result. So it's not like self-explanatory, okay? So it's really something, the ability of the model to actually predict the increase in inflation is something that we consider a good validation. We discussed at length the role of auxiliary assumptions. All you need is a New Keynesian model, okay? So here is a stylized New Keynesian model, a 3 equations New Keynesian model. You essentially get the same results. You see, this is the model very similar to what I use at Jackson Hole. And you can see that you get, again, this big spike in inflation toward the end, even with the stylized model. So let me conclude. So what we do in this paper is to propose a fiscal theory of trend inflation. So we take a fairly standard New Keynesian model and we augment it with these unfunded fiscal shocks. We have a monetary-led and a fiscally led policy mix that coexist at the same time. The idea is that policymakers react differently to these shocks. And the key message of the paper is that historically, a little bit of fiscal inflation has actually helped the US economy to avoid deflation in the post-Great Recession period. But now we have record high level of debt to GDP ratio. This implies that even a small change in perception about unfunded debt is going to be catastrophic for inflation dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco, very much. And before we turn to our next presentation, again, I remind everybody that they're welcome to write comments or questions in the Q&A session if they'd like to. So with that, we'll turn to Alberto, who will be discussing for us detecting changes in inflation trends using high-frequency data.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to switch gears and focus on a completely empirical work that it's at a preliminary stage. Let me be clear on that. But I think many of the particular policymakers as well will find this relevant. The idea is simple. We're trying to detect structural breaks in the recent inflation data by leveraging high-frequency inflation data that I have access to. So a financial disclosure here, the data I'm going to use today comes from a company called PriceStats, which was connected to the Billion Prices project. And it's using online data to produce high-frequency inflation indicators. So I'm going to try to leverage this data and then apply a methodology to this, identify structural breaks. And this is joint work with Gaston Garcia Zabaleta, who is at the Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina. So let me show you some results. Essentially, what we're trying to determine is if the increase in interest rates that central banks have implemented during most of 2022 has already led us to a change in the inflation trend. You can call that a new inflation regime, or another way of thinking about it is whether we have already experienced peak inflation or not. You can ask that question in many ways, but essentially the intuition is whether we are already on a new inflation trajectory. And most of the time that people make this analysis, they focus on the annual inflation rates, which is what I'm showing you. Here on the left, you have the chart for US annual inflation rates for several indicators. You have the CPI, the PCE. These are the non-seasonally adjusted versions, just to clarify, all items, indices. And then you have the ones you can create with online data. There are some levels differences because of sectors, but the dynamics in many of these indicators are quite similar. And obviously, when we got to the point, you know, in September, October, that's when policymakers would have liked to have a clear idea of whether there was an inflection point already or not. By the time, you know, at this point, maybe they can be more sure. But the idea here will be to try to see if we can quickly detect these changes in inflation trends. When you on the right, I have also posted some annual inflation rates for also from online data in European countries. You can see the picture here is more mixed. You can argue that the data suggests that countries like Germany and Italy seem to be over the peak, where others, the trends are not so clear. For example, in the UK, there's a little bit of evidence. But my point here is to argue that the annual inflation rates are not ideal for this question. They're affected by base effects and other complications that make the answer complicated or not easy to produce. The other alternative is to use monthly inflation rates but then you still have the question on whether you should be focusing on just 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. We need to compare them to the trends we saw in previous years. Of course, we can do some seasonal adjustments, but are those being correctly done? Has the season changed or not? Those are questions that complicate the analysis. You can certainly get a bit excited with these downward trends that we see here, but there's always this problem of comparison. I will argue in the paper, together with Gaston, we argue that the best way to identify a change in the inflation trend is to actually look at the price indices. With high frequency data, this becomes quite clear. What I'm showing you here on the left is simply the price index plotting on a log scale. So the slope of this index is essentially an inflation rate, which is defined in terms of time period very flexibly. You can even graphically look at this chart, and you would think that potentially there are 3 inflation regimes here. There was, or trends. There was a trend that lasted until the end of 2021. This rate is actually higher than what we had seen before the pandemic, but still at a level that wasn't necessarily so worrisome. Then in January of 2022, the rate seems to change even before the Ukrainian crisis hits. You can see that spike here in the middle of that part. That's the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine, sorry. And then something happened in June where we started seeing these price indices, these are aggregate indices, stabilizing. So what is the advantage here? Well, first of all, this is a very simple idea of just measuring the slope as the trend of inflation. It gives us this flexible time frame for analysis. And then the best advantage here is that we can try to apply standard techniques for identifying structural breaks in the estimations of these coefficients. So I'm gonna have a slide on methodology next, where I emphasize this. I should mention I haven't seen this type of structural break methodology applied to CPI. I believe the reason is that the data is too sparse for you to get power in the test, but it's something we hope to explore in the next stages of the paper. Now, we argue that with high frequency daily data, in this case, we can statistically identify the structural breaks. in the time series. It's essentially a very intuitive approach and a well-known methodology. You run a regression, and a linear regression in this case, and then you test for the stability of those coefficients, and you let the data speak for itself, and the test methodology allows you to identify where the actual break in the series can be found. No? And for this round of results that I'm showing you today, we're going to be testing for just a single break in the last 12 months. This is a test for an unknown date, so we let the command, the statistical process algorithm, if we will, determine what that break date is. We have some parameters here on the test, so we set the trim percentage to 10%. So the idea here is that at the beginning and last part of the samples, you don't have enough observations to actually have a powerful test. So we're gonna ignore the first and last month, essentially, a little bit more at the beginning and the end of our sample. So that's important to keep in mind. The technique itself won't necessarily identify trend breaks that happened within the last month in particular. And then the other thing we do after running the tests is we manually, if you will, ignore breaks where the slope change is less than 1%. This is to try to get rid of trend breaks that are statistically significant, but they have a very small magnitude that we think is not relevant for practical purposes. But that's one of the parameters we need to carefully think about moving forward. And then the other advantage of the data and what I'm going to do today is not only we can just look at these high frequency indices, identify structural breaks, but we can do that across disaggregated sectors and essentially build a measure that gives us a sense of how widespread the inflection points are. We're going to compute the share of sectors or alternatively CPI weights that have experienced a negative trend break in the last year. That gives us an idea of whether we are really in a new territory or whether the effects and changes in trends are, not just about a few sectors like maybe the case with energy recently, but rather they're broad-based and really telling us something about the dynamics of inflation across many sectors. So let me show you how that actually works if I start applying the data at different levels of aggregation. First, on the left, you have the US data index. The methodology suggests that there was structural break around June 14th. On the right, you can see the one in the Eurozone around the same time, June 23rd. We identify a structural break in the price index. Obviously, if you're looking at this data, I think this is coming from energy, and you would be absolutely right. The biggest change actually happened in energy. You can see that here. I'm showing you the two big headline sectors, fuel and food for the US. On the left, you have a big change in energy that happened around June. Prices had risen significantly since the beginning of the year, and then they've gone back already to the level we were seeing last year. But clearly, there's a huge change. Where if you focus on food on the right in the US, the trend actually is relatively stable over time. Statistically, we can identify a small change around September of 2022 in the data, but the magnitude is clearly very different. If we focus on core goods, we get mixed signals. Interestingly, there are some core good sectors. For example, this is household and furnishings, where we saw a break relatively early. It was a relatively small change, but it happened relatively early, around April. Interestingly, this is one of the sectors you could claim is greatly affected by demand and therefore should be more responsive to Fed rate increases, and that seems to be the case here. On the right, I'm showing you what happened with healthcare. These are mostly healthcare goods. You can see that if you had used data until October, we would have identified a structural trend break around July. It was actually an increase in the trend break there, which I attributed at the time to some of the lockdowns in China affecting the imported healthcare goods, which represent, are a big share of the sample that we measure online. But lately, if you add more data to the sample, you would see that the strongest trend break actually happened in September of this year, again with a downward trajectory. So we can do this for all the sectors. What I'm going to show you now are results for 55 disaggregated sectors. These are 3-digit COICOPs. This is the most disaggregated level for which the official statistics have weights that I'm going to use as well here. I'm just showing you a histogram of the number of sectors that have experienced negative or positive trend breaks. And on the x-axis, I'm showing you the annualized change in the trend. Obviously, everything, I've labeled a few, so you get a sense of everything that is related to fuel, electricity in the US has experienced a big decline. Also, some durables for outdoor recreation have had significant negative changes in trends. And we get a few sectors as well that have had positive breaks, many of them in the food and beverages sectors like oil and fats here, and some services that have also experienced a positive increase. But if I try to summarize this in a simple, intuitive way, as of last week, when I last calculated this, I computed the share of the CPI weights, not just counting the sectors, in the share of sectors, but weighing them by their importance in the CPI basket. I find that 71% of those weights have experienced a break, a structural break that we can identify that is negative. So there's less inflation in those sectors. There are a few, 15%, that had a positive inflation trend break, and about 14% where we detect nothing throughout the last year. It's essentially having the same trend break now. So this next slide shows you how that happens graphically, how that number had been increasing over time. That's the share of sectors with trend breaks, the share of weights, I should clarify. So around October, no, I would actually argue that around August or September, we were already about 50% of the sectors experiencing negative trend breaks. One thing to note is this number hasn't changed much in the last part of the sample, and that's because of the problems I was telling you of using the last month or 2 months of data. We were not, the technique is not ideal for identifying very recent trend breaks, but it gives you a sense of how we stand today. This suggests that in terms of headline sectors, the US is past the peak of inflation. We can do the same thing for all the countries that we have in our sample. The table and the chart show you the same information in different ways, but let me quickly explain what this is. This is the share of weights that have experienced a negative trend break. Then we have the positive trend breaks and the ones that have experienced no break at all. And I've simply ranked the countries by the difference between negative and positive. The ones that have experienced the most slowdown is Russia, compared to the high rates of inflation it had after the war started in 2022. But we also have Canada and the US as countries where we find the largest share of negative minus positive increases, changes in trend. There's variability. I've drawn two lines separating countries. I believe everything that is above Netherlands, we could more credibly say that we are past the peak of inflation. These countries are countries where we see both negative and positive trend breaks, but a lot of uncertainty. Many sectors do not have any trend break at all. And then the countries at the bottom here are the countries where things are worse in terms of inflation dynamics. They mostly have positive trend breaks, the basket case being Argentina. And I should also mention France. There's some dispersion here for those who would be interested in European statistics. France is one of the countries which is not looking so good with this data in terms of trend breaks. Fortunately, these two countries had the World Cup final and they did well in soccer, but I won't get into that because I'm Argentinian and I may make some French participants mad. So I'll just focus back to the paper. I'm going to skip just briefly say we did the same analysis in September 2022. Compared to those numbers, nearly every country is doing better. So there are very few exceptions. For example, Poland is an exception, but most of them have been improving on that dimension. And you can do the same thing for core. And this is the last thing I'll mention. If you focus on the US, more than 50% of core CPI weights have experienced a negative trend break, which is reassuring for the US core numbers. Again, this table ranks countries by those numbers. China, supermarket, in data, Canada, Russia, those are all countries. And I should mention here, perhaps the UK, for those of you who are interested in Europe, shows is pretty up on top of this table. The US is not that far behind. So again, the US, I would argue, is past the peak of core inflation, assuming no additional shocks come in. At least that's what the analysis suggests. So bottom line, High frequency inflation data, I believe, can be used to detect the structural breaks in inflation trends. The data suggests that the US is potentially past the peak of inflation in both headline and core at this stage. Most countries are improving, not necessarily all. And we get these mixed results in Europe, which have this flavor that the previous part of the crisis seemed to be more affected by global shocks, a lot of synchronization in inflation dynamics, and we're starting to see some differences within Europe at this stage. In particular, as I mentioned, worse results in terms of inflation in France, Italy, and Poland relative to the UK, Spain, and Ireland, which look much better. And finally, just a caveat, and to tell you where we're going forward, this is preliminary work. Many questions remain for us. There's a clear question about optimal parameterization of the structural break algorithms. We only focus on identifying a single unknown break, but potentially there are ways to just focus on identifying multiple trend breaks. There's a question how soon we can detect them. Can we extrapolate and annualize some of these trends, taking into account different sectors? And as I mentioned before, how do the results compare with those that can be obtained with CPI data? But I'll stop there and I'm eager to hear some reactions and questions. Thank you.
Alberto, thank you very much. And also Francesco, thank you very much. So in the remaining time that we have a little under 10 minutes or so. If you haven't already, please enter some comments or questions into the Q&A. And I'm going to start off by asking a question to Francesco. This comes from Rafael. And let me see if I can find the question. Well, it looks like right now my chat seems to have disappeared for a second. So maybe I'm sorry, let me go to Alberto first then. Maria Oraca asks, thank you for your presentation. It is very interesting. How frequent would you say the data needs to be in order to get something informative from this exercise?
That's a great question. We haven't explored that. We've just done it with daily data. I believe the monthly data is too sparse. And one of the reasons that has prevented people from using this technique in monthly inflation data is probably that the tests don't have enough power. But weekly may be enough. So one of the things we should probably do in the paper is explore and get that answer. No? There are not that many weekly inflation indicators, although some statistical agencies do have those. But it's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer at this stage.
Okay. So I did manage to find my webinar chat, so I will now be able to ask Francesco the question from Rafael. So Francesco, through the lens of your model, how should we think about Japan, where the debt to GDP ratio may be and has been largely unfunded? And is there also a role of demographics?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a question that comes up often and allows me also to connect to the previous question. So the previous question was, and maybe that was Rafael, I don't know, it showed up as anonymous. The question was like, how do you explain the drop in inflation in the early 80s with the large increase in the debt to GDP ratio from the 80s to the 90s? Well, if you remember my graph with the impulse responses, when there is an unfunded fiscal shock, you have this inverse relation between inflation and the debt to GDP ratio. So what keeps the debt to GDP ratio low is low real interest rates and high GDP. So these unfunded fiscal shocks are, in a sense, financed through inflation, if you want to use that term. So once you have a shift from unfunded to funded, like in the early 80s under Volcker, but also under the Reagan administration, Reagan ran on a platform that was tough on inflation and tough on big government. The share of unfunded versus funded shifts. You move to funded, and this determines an increase in real interest rates, like we saw in the early 80s, a drop in GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio goes up. So in Japan, what is going on is largely, first of all, Japan is a bit particular because it's a bit hard to understand who exactly holds debt, but let's leave that aside for a moment. If you have willingness of agents to hold debt because there is the perception that it's not going to be inflated away, a large debt to GDP ratio is consistent with that equilibrium. So what happens is if that confidence starts fading away, then what you would see is inflation going up and the debt to GDP ratio going down. So that's when you see this reverse movement. So this allows me to clarify a little bit. Sometimes there is this idea fiscal inflation is equal to large debt to GDP ratio. Well, it's almost the other way around. I mean, a low debt to GDP ratio is often evidence that you don't have credibility to raise funds and debt. And I mean, we generally think along these lines for developing economies, where it's very clear that you don't have a large debt to GDP ratio exactly because nobody trusts you. Here is a bit more subtle because there is no plain default. It's more like fine-tuning in terms of how you're going to finance your spending. So thank you for the questions.
Sure. So Alberto, as in my role as moderator, I'm going to ask one of my own questions to you. And I guess my question is somewhat related to the concept of trend. So let me just take the experience with core goods inflation in the US right now during the pandemic. I think most people would argue that that surge in inflation we saw in core goods was a combination of consumers rotating out of services into goods. We had sort of supply side constraints hitting. Now we're seeing sort of, movements back into services, supply constraints loosening. So in some sense, that surge in inflation or goods inflation, and that sort of went up and is moving down, would you label that an increase in trend? Because in some sense, it would seem that one would argue that that was really sort of more of a transitory or temporary set of factors. So how would that enter into your definition of trend if I understand your methodology correctly?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. When we ask the question about trend, we have to make a call on the time period we're thinking about. Is this a long-term 2-year trend, or are we just focusing on more short-term trends? What I'm trying to do with the methodology, I think it gives us a lot of flexibility in that sense. I can just say, look, we ultimately care a lot in the policy discussions about the annual rates. So the essence would be, are we going to see annual rates falling or not? And that's the reason why I focus on the last year and then try to identify a trend breaks. There are some sectors that had that trend break at the beginning of the year, and it's a trend break. If you will, the trend now has lasted for 9 months. And then there are other sectors that may have experienced a trend break clearly in that yearly data that happened 2 months ago. So I think that's where some of the value of this analysis comes from not having to take a stand on a particular time frame for analysis, but simply saying within the last year, or within the last perhaps 2 years, that's also a valid question, but within a given time frame, how many sectors we have seen a change in this slope, which is essentially an inflation rate, not defined by a monthly or quarterly basis, but rather as a trajectory of where the price level is heading in each one of these sectors. No? So that's how I think about it in these terms, as a change in the slope or trajectory of prices in each one of these sectors.
Okay, great, thanks. And in the remaining time, Alberto Francesco will finish up with you. In a monetary union like the EU, isn't there also a political equilibrium mechanism which might imply constraints on unfunded debt?
Oh yeah. The European Union is a very interesting case because yes, you have all this political economy aspect. I'm not really sure that the European Union now has a very forceful way to avoid the countries running unfunded spending. I think it's that what makes the whole union fragile. I have another paper in which we discuss the Eurobonds as a way to separate what is responsibility of the whole euro area versus responsibility of the single countries, exactly as a way to bring clarity about what is what can be accommodated by the ECB and what cannot be accommodated. So right now, yes, I think it's a fascinating question because it's not clear what the ECB would do if one country were kind of being very slow in implementing fiscal adjustments. Would they let the euro go down? Probably not. And that's what all the political debate in Europe these days. But yeah, I think this is possibly even more interesting for the euro area than the US.
Great. So let me again thank both Francesco and Alberto for your presentations. Thank you so much for joining us today. Unfortunately, we have to end on that note. And thank you again to all our participants who signed in, and again to Rafael and Dominic who were available. And I believe that the next scheduled session will be, Raphael, you want to remind everybody when the next scheduled session happens to be?
I believe it's actually in a week or two, but we will post this on all kinds of channels online. And thank you also from my side so much for these presentations and the questions.
Great.
Thank you for having us. And the Zebra office says that is next week on January 26th.
Thank you. Thank you for doing my job for me. Thank you so much, Francesca. Again, thanks
Of course,
to everyone.
a pleasure.
Have a great day, and thank you again for the presentations. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.